The Arizona sun beat down relentlessly on Dry Gulch in the summer of 2019, baking the earth until it cracked like old pottery. Jedediah Harper, Jed to everyone who knew him, felt the heat seep into his bones, mirroring the cold dread that had settled in his gut. For 3 generations, the Harper family hadn't just farmed this land, they'd coaxed life from it, sustained by the steady murmur of Cottonwood Creek, a ribbon of blue-green winding through their 50 acres. Now that ribbon was being choked off. A crisp, impersonal notice lay on his worn kitchen table, its official letterhead mocking the sweat and history soaked into the wood grain. The city of Dry Gulch, in collusion with the gleaming, soulless entity known as Apex Innovations, had declared the creek water necessary for public good, specifically a sprawling new tech campus promising jobs and prosperity. Prosperity Jedediah suspected would bypass families like his entirely. His corn, usually standing proud and green by this time, already showed the telltale signs of thirst, leaves curling inward as if in pain. He watched helplessly. The image of his grandfather, hands calloused and strong, digging the original irrigation channels burned into his memory. This wasn't just water. It was legacy, survival, the echo of his late wife Sarah's laughter during harvest festivals, the scraped knees of his daughter Clara learning to ride her bike between the rustling stalks. Clara, now a young woman with her father's determined jaw but eyes clouded with worry, traced the outline of the water stain left by Jed's coffee cup, her silence more potent than any outburst. He'd tried reasoning. 3 separate town council meetings, armed with deeds and water rights documents dating back to 1932, yellowed paper brittle with age. He'd presented them respectfully, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, explaining the symbiotic relationship between his farm and the town's history. Mayor Reginald Bloomberton III, a man whose ambition seemed physically inflated beneath his tailored suits, had offered condescending smiles and vague platitudes about progress. Jedediah had scraped together money he didn't have for a local lawyer, a man named Henderson with weary eyes who specialized in David and Goliath property disputes. Henderson had been honest, his words a death knell to Jed's dwindling hope. Apex Innovations had deep pockets, lining the campaign funds of every council member, including the puffed-up Mayor Bloomberton. The lawyer promised to keep fighting, a futile gesture against an oncoming storm, but advised Jedediah to prepare for the worst. The worst had arrived yesterday in a gleaming black SUV that looked offensively opulent parked beside Jed's dusty, rusting fence. 2 men in slick suits, reeking of cologne and corporate condescension, hadn't even bothered with pleasantries. Silas Blackwood, Apex's local spearhead, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold eyes, had delivered the ultimatum: 20% of market value for an immediate sale, a sum that was an insult to generations of toil, or watch his crops wither and lose everything to the bank. Their choice, they'd called it, as if starvation or surrender were viable options. That evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple over his dying fields, Jedediah felt a profound loneliness. Then, a sputtering cough broke the quiet, followed by a frustrated curse. A rusty pickup truck, older than his own, had ground to a halt right in front of his property line, steam hissing from under the hood like an angry kettle. An older man, face etched with the lines of hard miles and harder experience, climbed out and aimed a kick at a flat tire, the gesture more resignation than anger. Despite the weight crushing his own spirit, Jedediah couldn't ignore someone in need. He grabbed his tools, the familiar weight a small comfort, and walked down the dusty drive. He offered help, a simple gesture of neighborliness. The stranger, introducing himself gruffly as Walt Kowalski, accepted with a curt nod. As Jedediah wrestled with the stubborn lug nuts, the conversation flowed haltingly. He found himself pouring out his troubles, the water, the council, the corporate vultures. Walt listened intently, his quiet gaze missing nothing, asking pointed questions about the farm's history, the creek's flow, the specific wording of the old deeds. There was a stillness about Walt, a sense of contained energy, like a coiled spring. When the tire was changed, Walt wiped his hands on an oily rag, his eyes meeting Jed's. He spoke quietly, his voice raspy but firm, acknowledging the unfairness of the world but adding a cryptic admonition against giving up just yet. Jedediah barely registered the words, preoccupied with the gnawing anxiety about the looming deadline. He didn't know, couldn't possibly guess that this chance encounter, this simple act of kindness, offered by a man drowning in his own problems, had just thrown him a lifeline woven from unforeseen threads of loyalty and power. Jedediah tossed and turned all night, the phantom scent of dying corn heavy in the air. Dawn broke pale and unforgiving, illuminating the parched fields that mocked his family's legacy. He walked the rows, touching the brittle leaves, the weight of impending ruin pressing down like the Arizona heat. The bank had been clear. Without secured water rights, the loan extension was impossible. Financial ruin wasn't weeks away. It felt imminent, a suffocating presence. Tucked under his screen door was a small, folded piece of paper, not a business card, just a name, Walt Kowalski, and a phone number scrawled in utilitarian block letters. No company, no title. Jed slipped it into his pocket, a tiny, improbable anchor in a sea of despair, and headed into Dry Gulch for the emergency community meeting Mayor Bloomberton had reluctantly called. The community center buzzed with anxious energy. Farmers and small business owners crammed shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of anger and fear. Mayor Bloomberton stood at the podium, radiating false sincerity, flanked by the impeccably dressed Silas Blackwood and another Apex executive whose expression suggested boredom. Bloomberton launched into a practiced speech, extolling the virtues of the Apex project, 300 jobs, economic revitalization, the dawn of a new era for Dry Gulch. He spoke of progress, inevitably requiring sacrifice, his gaze carefully avoiding Jedediah's section of the crowd. Jedediah felt a surge of righteous anger. He rose, his voice trembling slightly but carrying through the hushed room. He spoke of his family's 80 years of sacrifice, of his father letting the town use their pasture for the county fair every summer without charge, of donating crops during the drought of '95 when others hoarded. Mayor Bloomberton shifted uncomfortably, his manufactured smile tightening. He acknowledged the Harper family's contributions with dismissive haste, reiterating that the decision was final, the water rights irrevocably reassigned. Silas Blackwood stepped forward, his voice smooth as oil, offering compensation packages to affected farmers. Jedediah shot back, the word theft hanging sharp and ugly in the air, cutting through the corporate doublespeak. 20 cents on the dollar wasn't compensation. Several farmers murmured agreement, their resentment palpable. Jed's neighbor Hank, a burly man whose family had farmed nearby for 50 years, stood up, his voice thick with emotion. He reminded everyone that the Harper farm predated most of their own, that if the city could take Jedediah's water today, their own wells and ditches could be next. Blackwood's smile became a thin, predatory line. He announced the diversion would begin tomorrow at noon, advising everyone to consider the generous offers before it was too late. The implicit threat hung heavy in the room. Walking home under the oppressive sun, Jedediah felt defeated. A hand touched his shoulder. It was Brenda, who ran the local diner, her face etched with sympathy. She called the Apex men vultures, recalling how Jedediah's father had given her own father work during the lean years when no one else would. Her kindness was a small balm, but offered little practical help. Back at the farmhouse, Clara sat amidst a scattering of old photo albums, her eyes distant. She pointed to a faded picture of her mother organizing the Harvest Festival, beaming, ensuring every family in town, even the Bloombertons, received a basket of fresh produce. The memory tightened Jedediah's throat. The farm wasn't just land, it was community, shared history, interwoven lives. That evening, staring at the simple name and number on the scrap of paper, Jedediah hesitated. What could this stranger, Walt, possibly do? Yet what did he have to lose? He dialed the number. Walt answered on the second ring. Jed identified himself, mentioning the flat tire. Walt's reply was unexpectedly calm and direct. He'd been looking into Jedediah's situation. Could Jedediah meet him at the farm tomorrow, 10 o'clock? Jedediah expressed his doubt. The water was being cut off at noon. Walt's response was simple, devoid of explanation but carrying an odd weight of authority. Trust me, I'm bringing people who can help. Jedediah hung up, bewildered, a flicker of something akin to hope warring with years of hard-earned cynicism. He barely slept, the approaching dawn bringing not just another day of heat, but the specter of the noon deadline. Jedediah walked his fields one last time in the pale morning light, the air still and heavy with anticipation. He tried to memorize the curve of the land against the sky, the way the light hit the old barn his grandfather built, the scent of dry earth and wilting corn, a view cherished by generations. By his grim calculations, the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings within 3 weeks once the water was gone. It felt like attending his own funeral. Around 9:30, Clara joined him on the porch, her face pale. Suddenly, a faint rhythmic thumping disturbed the morning quiet, a sound utterly alien to the rural landscape. It grew steadily louder, deeper. Jedediah squinted towards the horizon, shielding his eyes against the rising sun. Disbelief warred with the undeniable evidence of his senses. A helicopter, not some small news chopper or agricultural sprayer, but a large olive-drab machine with unmistakable military bearing, was heading straight for his farm. It descended with controlled power, landing in the empty pasture behind the barn, its rotor wash flattening the tall grass and kicking up a cloud of dust. Jedediah and Clara watched, stunned into silence, as the side door slid open and 4 figures emerged. Leading them was Walt Kowalski, no longer the dusty roadside mechanic, but dressed in clean pressed slacks and a button-down shirt, his posture straighter, his quiet intensity now focused. Beside him stood a tall man whose silver hair and erect posture screamed military discipline, even in his civilian clothes. A palpable aura of command surrounded him. 2 others, a woman with a sharp, intelligent face carrying a briefcase, and a man with equally serious demeanor holding maps, followed closely. Walt waved them towards the porch. He made the introductions, his voice calm but resonant. Jedediah found himself shaking hands with Lieutenant General Arthur Pendleton, retired United States Marine Corps. The general's grip was firm, his eyes assessing Jedediah with unnerving clarity. Walt, it turned out, wasn't just some random stranger. He was General Pendleton's old platoon mate from Vietnam. The general stated simply that Walt had told him about Jedediah's situation, and while Walt didn't exaggerate, he'd needed to see it for himself. Jedediah, still reeling, managed to express his appreciation, but reminded them of the imminent deadline. The water cutoff was less than 2 hours away. The general nodded curtly. That was precisely why they were there. He introduced the others. Eleanor Vance, an environmental lawyer whose gaze seemed capable of dissecting legal documents from across the room, and Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a renowned water rights specialist whose fingers already traced the lines on his maps. Clara, recovering her composure, invited them inside. Around the scarred kitchen table, where Jedediah's family had shared countless meals, the atmosphere crackled with unexpected energy. Eleanor Vance opened her laptop, its modern sleekness contrasting sharply with the rustic surroundings. She addressed Jedediah directly, her tone crisp and businesslike. The city's water diversion, she explained, violated no fewer than 3 federal statutes. Crucially, the required environmental impact assessment was woefully inadequate, rushed, and potentially falsified. Dr. Tanaka spread his maps, pointing to the Cottonwood Creek. He explained that the creek, being a tributary to a larger navigable waterway downstream, fell under the protection of the Federal Clean Water Act, placing it squarely under federal jurisdiction, not local whim. Jedediah leaned forward, hope battling disbelief. He'd mentioned federal regulations to the council, but they'd arrogantly brushed him off, claiming economic benefits superseded his dusty old claims. Eleanor Vance stated firmly that the council possessed no such authority. And there was more. Her investigation had uncovered significant donations from Apex Innovations subsidiaries flowing directly into the campaign coffers of Mayor Bloomberton and several key council members just before the vote on the water diversion project. The timing was, she noted dryly, highly suggestive. General Pendleton studied the maps, then looked at Jedediah. Walt had mentioned the farm's long history. Jedediah spoke of his grandfather buying the land during the Dust Bowl, finding water when everyone else saw only desolation. Walt prompted him to mention his father. Jed explained his dad had been a Marine, fought in Korea, a detail he rarely shared. The general's expression shifted subtly. Korea? Chosin Reservoir? Jed confirmed it. 1st Marine Division. The general's voice grew quiet. His own father had been there too, in a different company. Those men, he murmured, had faced hell together. Eleanor checked her watch, bringing them back to the urgent present. She had prepared an emergency injunction and already contacted the regional EPA office. Dr. Tanaka added that an EPA inspector was en route, due that very afternoon. A fragile hope, tentative but real, bloomed in Jedediah's chest for the first time in weeks. He had to ask why they were doing all this for him, a stranger. The general looked him straight in the eye. Walt had told him how Jedediah stopped to help him, a stranger with a broken-down truck, when Jedediah himself was facing ruin. That single act, the general stated, spoke volumes about his character. Walt added quietly that mentioning his father's service, especially the Marine connection, sealed it. Marines, he explained, look after their own, a bond stretching across generations. Clara squeezed her father's hand, her eyes shining. The general stood up, the quiet authority returning. It was time, he declared, to go meet the mayor and his corporate friends. They were expecting to turn off Jedediah's water at noon. They were in for a surprise. The minutes ticked agonizingly towards noon. Down by the creek, where the water flowed onto Jedediah's property, for now, The scene was set for the final act of dispossession. 3 city vehicles emblazoned with the official Dry Gulch seal that now seemed like a brand of betrayal were parked haphazardly. Nearby gleamed Silas Blackwood's ostentatious black SUV, a stark symbol of corporate power intruding on the parched earth. Workers in hard hats bustled about, unloading pipes and equipment, their movements efficient and impersonal. Mayor Reginald Bloomberton III stood surveying the scene, arms crossed, attempting an air of decisive leadership, though a slight sheen of sweat betrayed his nervousness under the relentless sun. Silas Blackwood hovered beside him, radiating smug confidence. They both turned as Jedediah's dusty pickup truck rumbled down the track, followed closely by a nondescript sedan driven by the general's helicopter pilot. Jedediah parked and stepped out, flanked by Walt Kowalski, whose quiet presence seemed amplified in the tense standoff. Mayor Bloomberton's practiced smile faltered as he saw Jedediah wasn't alone, though relief flickered briefly as he didn't immediately spot the high-powered backup. He addressed Jedediah with forced joviality, remarking on his company but stating firmly it changed nothing. Just then, the sedan door opened and General Arthur Pendleton emerged, followed by Eleanor Vance and Dr. Kenji Tanaka. The general stepped forward, his presence instantly commanding attention. He addressed the mayor directly, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable ring of authority. He introduced himself, Lieutenant General James Holloway, retired, reminding Bloomberton that they hadn't met officially, though the mayor's office had certainly benefited from federal funding for the town's Veterans Memorial, funding channeled through the general's former command last year. Bloomberton's jaw tightened, his eyes darting nervously towards Blackwood. The mayor stammered about the unexpectedness of the general's visit. The general replied coolly that it was a matter of law and principle. He nodded to Eleanor Vance. With precise movements, she stepped forward and handed the mayor a thick sheaf of documents. This, she announced clearly, was a federal emergency injunction, legally preventing the water diversion. She elaborated, stating the environmental impact assessment was not only inadequate but potentially fraudulent, and federal agencies were now involved. Silas Blackwood bristled, stepping forward to assert this was purely a local matter, that they had no jurisdiction. Dr. Tanaka preempted him, opening his briefcase. Actually, he countered smoothly, they did. He reiterated the creek's status under the Clean Water Act as a tributary to federally regulated waters. Then came the hammer blow. Dr. Tanaka produced copies of financial records, handing them directly to the stunned mayor and the suddenly pale Blackwood. These documents, he explained, meticulously detailed substantial donations from known Apex Innovation subsidiaries flowing into the campaign funds of specific council members immediately preceding the favorable vote on the water diversion project. The implication of quid pro quo hung heavy and poisonous in the air. Bloomberton's face flushed a dangerous shade of purple. He sputtered about perfectly legal campaign contributions. Eleanor Vance cut him off sharply. Perhaps, she conceded, but failing to recuse themselves from votes directly benefiting those donors constituted a flagrant violation of state ethics laws. The EPA inspector, she reminded them coolly, arriving that afternoon would make a final determination on the environmental and procedural violations. Blackwood grabbed the mayor's arm, pulling him aside for a hushed, frantic conversation that quickly grew heated. Jedediah stepped closer to the creek, the sound of its gentle flow a balm to his frayed nerves. Walt joined him, his gaze fixed on the panicked officials. He murmured to Jedediah that when he'd broken down yesterday he could have called the general immediately, but something told him to wait, to see the measure of Jedediah's character when no one seemingly important was watching. The mayor, visibly sweating now, approached Jedediah, his tone suddenly conciliatory. Perhaps, he suggested weakly, they had been hasty. Apex, he added quickly, glancing at Blackwood for confirmation, had authorized him to propose a compromise. The general stepped forward, his expression unreadable. They were listening. Bloomberton offered to relocate the water diversion point downstream, leaving Jedediah's access intact. Eleanor Vance shook her head instantly. And the other affected farmers? Bloomberton conceded grudgingly that adjustments could be discussed. The general looked at Jedediah. It was his call. Jedediah looked at the creek, thought of his father, his grandfather, the neighbors like Hank who stood with him. He straightened his shoulders. Not good enough. Every farmer, he stated firmly, retains their historic water rights. Apex Innovations could apply for proper permits, conduct a legitimate, transparent environmental study, and follow the law if they wanted water access in Dry Gulch. Blackwood protested, aghast, that this would delay their precious project by months, maybe longer. Jedediah met his glare evenly. Yes, he replied simply, it would. The general consulted his watch, the gesture deliberate. It was precisely noon. He advised the mayor that his workers should probably cease unloading equipment, unless Bloomberton fancied explaining to a federal judge why he was violating a court-ordered injunction. Defeated, the mayor signaled frantically to the workers, who began, with confused reluctance, to pack up. Blackwood and the other Apex suit retreated hastily to their SUV, engaging in another furious, but ultimately futile discussion. The water continued to flow onto Jedediah Harper's land. 3 days later, the dust had literally and figuratively begun to settle. Jedediah sat at his kitchen table, the same table where the notice of doom had lain just days before, now covered with documents outlining not ruin, but restitution. Eleanor Vance and Dr. Kenji Tanaka reviewed the settlement agreement with him. Apex Innovations, faced with mounting evidence of environmental violations found by the EPA inspector and the politically toxic specter of the ethics investigation, had completely withdrawn their water diversion plan. They weren't just backing off, they were paying for a comprehensive independent water usage study for the entire county. Future development, Eleanor explained, would have to operate within sustainable limits, respecting established rights. Robert pointed to another clause, a testament to Jedediah's steadfastness. Apex agreed to fund significant irrigation improvements for all the farmers initially targeted, installing modern, efficient systems that would actually reduce overall water consumption while maintaining crop yields. Jedediah felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in months. He asked about Mayor Bloomberton and the council. The State Ethics Commission had formally opened an investigation, Eleanor confirmed with quiet satisfaction. 2 council members had already resigned in disgrace, and Bloomberton's political future looked bleak. Clara came in carrying a fresh pot of coffee, her smile radiant. Neighbors had been calling all morning, she reported, already organizing a thank-you barbecue for the weekend. Outside, Walt Kowalski and General Pendleton were walking the property line near the creek, inspecting the flow. Jedediah joined them, the Arizona sun feeling warm and benevolent for the first time in a long while. He was still trying to process the whirlwind of events. The general remarked that Jedediah's father would be proud, standing his ground not just for himself but for the entire community. Jedediah nodded, still grappling with the scale of their intervention. He voiced the question that lingered: why go to such extraordinary lengths for a stranger? The general looked out across the fields, a thoughtful expression on his face. After Walt called him, he'd made a few inquiries. Jedediah's father, he revealed, had earned a Bronze Star for valor in Korea, an action that directly saved lives in the general's own father's unit during that brutal Chosin Reservoir campaign. A debt, the general implied, long outstanding but never forgotten. Many of those men never spoke of the war, carrying their burdens silently. Walt, standing beside them, added a wry smile. Plus, he quipped, the general needed a good fight. Retirement was proving dangerously boring. The general chuckled, a surprisingly warm sound. There was something about seeing good people bullied by the powerful and greedy, he admitted. Some battles, he mused, simply choose you. That Saturday evening, the Harper farm buzzed with life. Neighbors filled the yard, tables laden with potluck dishes under the old oak tree, Hank's famous ribs, Brenda's pies, countless salads and sides. Children chased fireflies near the creek, their laughter mingling with the murmur of adult conversation. The newly appointed acting mayor, Bloomberton's former deputy, approached Jedediah, shaking his hand firmly. He confessed he'd opposed the Apex deal internally, but had been outvoted. What happened, he assured Jedediah, had fundamentally changed things in Dry Gulch. They were already rewriting the water ordinances with genuine community input. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, General Pendleton raised a glass, not to himself or his team, but to Jedediah Harper, a reminder that one person grounded in principle could indeed stand against giants. Jedediah, feeling the warmth of community around him, shook his head slightly, offering a counter-toast to neighbors and unexpected friends, without whom he would have lost everything. 6 months later, Jedediah stood in his fields, now lush and green thanks to the new water-saving irrigation system. Cottonwood Creek flowed clear and steady. He'd been appointed chair of the county's new Water Conservation Committee, turning his ordeal into advocacy. He often thought back to that sweltering afternoon helping a stranger fix a flat tire, a simple act of decency that had unknowingly set in motion the salvation of his farm, his legacy. Karma, he mused, worked in mysterious ways. He had framed a photograph taken at the barbecue. His family, his neighbors, Walt, the general, Eleanor and Kenji, all smiling under the oak tree. It was a reminder that while money and power often seemed insurmountable, sometimes aided by loyalty, courage, and the long reach of past good deeds, The good guys actually won. On the back, Jedediah had written his father's often repeated advice: do right, especially when no one's watching. You never know who might be.